much for inviting me to speak to you all today. It's a privilege to be invited to speak in your series. I have, as some of you might know, worked with Kevin Hegarty for quite a few years, and it feels odd that I've not actually visited you in person in Edmonton, so this is kind of the next best thing, so it's really nice to be here. So thanks all of you for coming, and welcome to this talk I'm about to give. I just need to, I've got an alert on my screen, sorry guys, I just need to get rid of that, there we go. I'm not quite sure about everyone's backgrounds in the room, probably because I can't really see you, but what I'm assuming in this talk is that there is a degree of interdisciplinarity in the room. So at some points in the talk, you might find that what I'm talking about is extremely familiar. At other points, maybe not. So I just ask you to bear with me as I go through my arguments, as I'm coming from an interdisciplinary perspective myself. So this talk, for me, represents a return to surveillance, workplace surveillance, after sort of a 5 or 6 year break. And I've been working on workplace surveillance essentially since the 1990s, really, when I did my doctorate on that topic. But for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been working on other things like national security and privacy and surveillance. But earlier in the year, I was invited by a project called CALEEM. The CALEEM stands, it's on the slide there, it stands for Collaborative Economy and Employment. And it's a project run by the Joint Research Council of the European Commission. And they asked me to do a comprehensive literature review on the current state of affairs in workplace surveillance, not just in face-to-face work, but also in platform work and pandemic response remote work. So I've done this huge piece of work this year, and the report that I've written from it is out now, and I've actually passed a copy of it to Nicole in case you'd like to see it. And in this talk, I'm going to be referring to the platform work chapter of that report. And whilst I did a lot of digging around that, it's not something I was extremely familiar with. The process of doing the research for the report actually started to challenge my thinking a little bit around workplace surveillance. And it's those thoughts that I want to share with you today in my talk. This is the report. As you can see, it's in the exciting design vernacular of the European Commission. The full reference is on the slide, and maybe the slides will be shared later on. And there's a URL there where you can actually get straight to the document, and there's a little bit of a health warning around that because the report itself was posted to that URL. I had a look at it, there was loads of snags with it, so I've been through it and they're in the process of uploading the final version to that URL, and hopefully that will happen in the next fortnight or so. But if you really can't wait, Nicole has a copy of that final version of the report. So let me tell you about the structure of what I'm going to talk about today. Now, first of all, I'd like to account for the method that I used to create this piece of work that I'm going to be talking about. I did a sort of a systematic review and the classic 5-phase systematic review. So I do want to tell you what I've done and how I coded the data, because I think it's important to account for that. Then I'm going to move on to platform work and talk about essentially what it is, but also characterize it in terms of the algorithmic control that runs through platform work. And then talk about what's really interesting to me, which is how workers comply with and resist and negotiate the algorithmic control that's inherent in platform work. I'll be taking some steps across to labour process theory in that part of the talk. After that, I'm going to be sharing my thoughts about how that challenges the way that we approach workplace surveillance, just before drawing some brief conclusions, then I'll look forward very much to hearing your reactions. So I'll now move on to talk about the actual method. The next slide is going to illustrate what the inside of my head was like probably for most of this year, and here it is. So the systematic review was done in 3 stages, and the 3 stages really reflect the demands of the Joint Research Council in terms of what they wanted me to do. So the first stage of the review was attempting to surface literature about workplace surveillance and monitoring within the traditional workplace. And as you can see there, I combined all the different keywords and came up with a master list of nearly 400 articles, a lot of which I knew already. At this point, you might be wondering why I'm referring to surveillance and monitoring separately. The reason for this is that the literature on workplace surveillance stroke monitoring goes back about 50 years, and it's split in terms of disciplines. On the one side, we have organisational psychology and occupational psychology. They use the term monitoring when they talk about this phenomenon. On the other side, we have work from employment relations, industrial relations, work sociology and organisation studies, and organisation studies is my discipline. And we tend to use surveillance as the term. So that really reflects the more critical commitments of that side of the disciplinary divide, whereas there are less, I wouldn't say less critical, but different sort of epistemological commitments from the psychologists. But I would say the thing that brings them together is this focus on fairness, ethics and justice in the way that surveillance stroke monitoring plays out in the workplace. And I get continually frustrated by the two disciplines not talking to, or the two sides of the argument really not talking to each other. And this report that I've written actually was a great opportunity for me to start to bring them together. So that's kind of what the report does as well. So that's the first stage of the review. The second stage was where I started to look at the new context, so remote work and gig work. And as you can see there, there's millions of keywords which start to feed in here. So that was a huge amount of work, but actually it yielded about 100 articles. The majority there were the critical slant. So you can see that from the bottom with the use of surveillance and monitoring terms. And finally, it was like a bucket category. I looked at all these individual search terms to see if I missed anything, and actually there wasn't a lot that I had missed. So I think I went from nearly 600 articles, and I read a few books as well, down to a master list of about 400-ish. And in the final report, there's 280, I think, references. So it's a big piece of work. The data, when I gathered them, were coded according to existing frameworks that have been published in the monitoring field, one of which is mine that I wrote with Steve Margulis about 10 years ago, which attempted to bring together monitoring and surveillance literatures in a framework which enabled the two fields to be synthesized. So I use that. And also I need to acknowledge the work of Ravid and colleagues from, oh gosh, it was last year, wasn't it? Yeah, it was last year. And they brought together a sort of analytical framework more on the psychology literature. So I incorporated that as well. So that is what I've been doing all year pretty much. So let's move on to talk about, oh gosh, yes, there's one thing I forgot to tell you there. The codes I'm drawing on today relate to compliance and resistance and this idea of negotiated order. So that's what I'm drawing on today. Right, so let's move on to talk about platform work itself. So what I'd like to do first of all is kind of have that old definitional debate, and let's sort of set out the terrain of platform work and what we call Workplace 4.0. And this is very much the mission of the Joint Research Council at the minute. They are sort of surveying across Europe and trying to work out the extent of platform work. And as part of that, they've sort of done a classificatory exercise, which is what you can see on the slide there. So when we talk about platform work, we're talking about non-standard work, which is short-term paid per job work, and that work is contracted, executed and rewarded via a digital labour platform. Right, and that's a very specific type of work. And the Joint Research Council have worked very hard to classify, as I just said, the terrain, the platform working terrain, and in true management school or business school style, they managed to boil it down to a 2x2 matrix. And so this is as good a regime as any to set out the kind of range of platforms and the range of work that's done on them as far as digital labour goes. So if you look at the 2x2 matrix, and if you look at the horizontal line, you'll see one of the key distinctions is that above the horizontal line in that matrix, we have work which is done online, and it's mostly cognitive tasks. So they're distinguishing on the type of task. Below the centre horizontal line of the matrix, we have work that's done, it's called mobile labour markets, but now it's, well, they called it that then, but now they call it on-location labour markets. So we have manual work being done out in the world between embodied people that is still brokered via a platform. So that's the contrasting online and on location. And then if we take the vertical line of the matrix, and if you look to the left-hand side of it, we'll see that work here is characterised by having low to mid skill levels. And towards the right-hand side of the centre line, you'll see that work is characterised as having mid to high skill levels. So to give you some examples, if you start in the bottom left-hand corner, we have low to mid-skilled work that's done on location or manually out in the world. And here we find platforms like TaskRabbit, platforms like Uber, which is around deliveries, errands, and ride hail. So that kind of quite low skilled out in the world type work. But if you move to the right hand side of the matrix, you'll see that the work becomes higher skilled. So here is reference to a platform called Take Lessons, in which you can find tutors, music teachers, school subjects, language tutors, all kinds of things in that kind of more skilled area that's done between people. And then above the line, if you go to the left, we see Amazon Mechanical Turk, so low skilled online cognitive tasks. And Mechanical Turk it's sort of known as the last mile of artificial intelligence. So where we have people out in the world responding to work requests to help train algorithms. So that's questionnaire responses, maybe identifying things in images, editing bad reviews, transcribing audio. Some of that stuff is dealt with in that quadrant. And if we go to the right hand side, we have websites like Upwork, or platforms rather like Upwork, which is around sort of knowledge work. So building websites, editing video, doing voiceover, coding, that sort of thing. So that's the kind of terrain of platform work. And platform work's really sold on the idea that it's flexible, so you can build it around your day. It's accessible, so anyone can sign up to a platform and get work. And it's autonomous, so you can come and go as you wish in regards to your work on the platform. And in a lot of senses, people do it for lots of different reasons. A lot of sorry, I've lost my train of thought there slightly. So the ethnographies tend to highlight the reasons why people do it. So typically with something like Uber, you'll have, or any platform really, you'll have the hobbyists who kind of do it because they have a hobby or a skill or an interest that they want to make money from. You have part-timers who do it to supplement their main income. But platform work becomes quite difficult when it's your only source of income. So it can be incredibly precarious, it can be incredibly stressful, and you haven't got a lot of control over the kind of work you get and what you get paid for it. And there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, is that to be successful on a platform is quite difficult because platforms suffer from what we call the 80-20 effect. So we have 20% of people doing 80% of the work, and a long tail there of people who aren't really getting anything from it. And the reason why this happens is that a regular work allocation is actually quite difficult to establish, because whether you're awarded work on a platform is dependent on algorithmic decision making. It depends on things like your past performance and your customer rating. And if you don't have a track record, if you don't have past performance, if you don't have customer rating, what tends to happen is that people do unpaid work for quite a long period of time, maybe 2 or 3 months, to establish their customer ratings, to establish their performance record with the algorithm, and to start to build income. And you get less money at first as well. And the problem is that you have very little influence over this as a worker, because the platform rules are that you broker the work via the platform. You don't identify a potential customer and go and contact them off platform, because if that's discovered, your account is cancelled, you can't work anymore. The rates of pay aren't always transparent, and one of the problems with digital labour platforms is there are the territorial disparities in wages. The same work gets different pay depending on where you are in the world. Platforms can reject work if you're not, if it's deemed unsatisfactory. They don't have to explain that. So if you do it too slowly or whatever, you can be in trouble. And if things go wrong, the humans behind it aren't necessarily the easiest to get hold of. And studies of eBay vendors right through to Mechanical Turk, like people just typing things into computers, say the same thing. There's not a lot of accountability, help and support for workers as they're working. So the way that work is allocated via these platforms has been compared historically and in critical perspective to dockers and builders queuing up for precarious work outside the walls of the dock or the building site at the, you know, in the early industrial era, so early 1900s. It's also been compared to domestic service work and homework, the piece-rate kind of garment assembly, for example, in the pre-industrial era. And it is a product of globalization, it is a product of financialization. It's the latest version of outsourcing, really. And it's outsourcing on a per task basis, not even on a per person basis, a fragment of a person. The main difference, though, is that unlike these historical examples, this is algorithmically managed work, it's algorithmically controlled work. And this is where a lot of these difficulties stem from. And if we were to use a surveillance studies lens at this point and refer to a surveillance studies concept, this is basically a massive panoptic sort. This is socially sorted work allocation. And so let's talk a little bit more about this algorithmic control. Now then, in this talk, I'm going to be referring on a number of occasions to this paper by Kellogg and colleagues that was published in the Academy of Management Review, and they did a really comprehensive treatment of control in platform work. And they set out a number of ways in which algorithms control work on platforms, from essentially cradle to grave. And interestingly, they all begin with R. And again, we're back in the business school world here. I've worked in business schools all my life, and it always tickles me how when we have frameworks, they always decide to start with the same letter. So we've got the 5 Ps of marketing, the 7 S's of organisational change, and now we have the 6 R's of algorithmic control. I think that's funny, but you might not. But anyway, so algorithms control work in 6 ways. First of all, they start by restricting the behaviours which are appropriate on the platform. It's limited to the measurable behaviours, the behaviours that generate the data that feed into the number crunching. Within the interface, they also control work by recommending courses of action, nudging people to do different things as they move through the system. And as they work, algorithms, they're also recording the activity that the worker is doing in real time, and it's rated and evaluated in real time as well. Once the results are in, the algorithm helps decide whether, if you're not good enough, you're just replaced, as in you're not offered any more opportunities, work opportunities not put in front of you for you to bid for or for you to do. And if you do well, you're rewarded through pay, but you're also entered into like this gamified interface, which is more fast and more intense work. So these 6 R's are the way that algorithms control work in platforms, according to Kellogg and colleagues, and I am convinced by their analysis. But what's super interesting is that you'll see on the slide here, on the bottom right hand side, there's a little table. When I was reading Kellogg's work as part of this review, I was very much reminded by this framework that I looked at when I was doing my PhD, and it's Grant and Higgins's pervasiveness model of workplace surveillance. And this was published in 1989 in a journal called the National Productivity Review, which I think is a US journal. And Grant and Higgins were trying to characterize the range of ways in which computers could monitor people as they worked. And they decided that pervasiveness was an interesting thing to explain, because pervasiveness is going to refer to like how much surveillance is in your face, really. And they said, well, there's 4 dimensions that it can vary along. The first is the object of surveillance. So is it where is it targeted? The second is the period of feedback, how quickly. The third is where the feedback goes to. And the fourth is how are the tasks allocated. And on the right hand side of that model, you've seen I've done the green column, I've done that column in green. And according to Grant and Higgins, the most pervasive form of workplace surveillance is where the object is the individual, where the time period of feedback is immediate, where the recipient of feedback is the wider public, and where the technology assigns and tracks tasks. And at that time, in the early 1990s, I thought no manager would choose to do that to employees. That would be disastrous in terms of stress, worker health, all those things. It would be very difficult to manage something like this in a healthy way. But sure enough, the same thing's going on in Amazon warehouses these days. And that, for me, very much describes the approach to worker surveillance that goes on the platforms as well. And Kershaw et al., who studied eBay vendors, summarize it extremely well. They've got a really lovely phrase. They talk about how platforms isolate the visibles, the workers are isolated visibles, and they're there fully visible as they're on the platform, and they're in front of this sort of opaque wall, coalition of the invisibles, the platform, the client, the algorithm, the platform staff, all those things, and they're kind of stood in front of this opaque wall, made completely visible. So I just thought that was a lovely way of characterizing that situation. I'm going to qualify that later in the talk, but that for me is very interesting. So how do people work within this particular framework? How do the isolated visibles kind of deal with platform-based surveillance? Extremely busy slide. Well, they do so by utilising and developing what Bucher and Chan and Humphreys call the algorithmic imaginary. The whole thing's invisible, so what do? You develop a tacit and practical knowledge as to how to deal with the demands of the technology, and also to how you manage yourself in the face of it. So when we look across the literature, we see all of these norms emerging around technical compliance with the sites, with the platforms, and we see this through things like Upwork as well as Deliveroo, so the range of types of work involved. Taina Bucher's work looks at Upwork, and she talks about how it seems very clear to workers that when they're on the platform, they don't complain, they don't report too many problems, they don't talk to clients too much. Veen and colleagues' work looks at Deliveroo and Uber Eats, and it's one of the strategies there is to hang out where the most lucrative work, the most lucrative deliveries are available, and you do that through experience, through learning where they are. Gallier's work on Deliveroo, actually, though, Deliveroo is a really interesting organisation because it does have local managers who interact with the riders. And so there's tacit knowledge circulating there about what measures the managers focus on, because on Deliveroo, you literally swipe every time you do a different component of the task. The whole thing is timed. The managers were telling the riders, okay, well, this is the one we focus on. So they were focusing on that measure, getting that as low as they possibly could. And the point here is that they avoid account deactivation. You don't want your behaviour to be considered outside the normal range and arouse suspicion of the algorithm, which then automatically cancels your account. On the more social side, on the more sort of normative side, obviously there's a socio-technical sort of bent on this slide, but on the social side, it was found that individual platform workers themselves were internalising certain things that the platform was doing as well. So Bruguière's work looks at Uber, and they found that drivers were looking at customer ratings before picking them up and allocating discretionary effort to those who did give good ratings, so they get a good rating. Kershaw's work with eBay vendors, and these are people who, in Kershaw's work, they weren't, I'm selling my old, my old bike or something like that, eBay vendors. They were people who had high performing businesses and eBay was their main selling channel. They were looking into customer backgrounds and blocking the ones and not serving the ones who gave bad reviews or complained. A really fascinating one with Gallier, so going back to the Deliveroo riders, Gallier's observation was that they were adopting these like hyper-meritocratic entrepreneurial identities, this sort of sporting survival of the fittest identity to kind of valorize their actions on the platform and like show how good they were as delivery riders. So that's very much, the hyper-meritocratic, numerical, quantified, calculative rationality of the platform. And finally, I just want to refer to Irani's work, again, Boucher, but Irani's work is also brilliant, how the norm was when dealing with a platform to hide the true emotions, to hide the material labour involved in actually complying with what the platform wants. And I'm going to come back to that later on in the talk as well. So through this algorithmic imaginary, platform workers develop these practical and tacit knowledges about how tasks are allocated to them, how they're rated and rewarded, and also how to influence that process. But what's really interesting is that whilst they sometimes do this as individuals, they also start to find each other, which is when we start to get to the question of maybe resistance, collective interests, and in some cases, solidarity and collective action. And I'm just going to show you an example here. This is a very surveillancey example. Some of you might have heard of this. This is the Turk-Opticon. And the Turk-Opticon is for workers on Mechanical Turk, and it's a surveillance website which gives Mechanical Turk workers the opportunity to rate and review the people who request work, the customers on Mechanical Turk, so that collectively they know who's good, who's bad, and who should be avoided, who's fine to work for. Turk-Opticon started as an art intervention maybe about 8 or 9 years ago, and has just grown legs, and it works. And I think it's sort of become a model in that you know, there's plenty of other forums now away from the platforms where workers share knowledge, and they even like form WhatsApp groups and communication networks to kind of support each other. But now I want to step into this question of resistance and sort of consider it in a little bit more detail. I'm going to start with a quote from Shapiro's work, because this is my jumping off point really. And Shapiro talks about how control, in the context of platform work, ultimately hinges on workers' willingness to conform to the calculated rationalities that companies project onto them. Workers reflect on the conditions of their work. They develop a sense of company strategies and tolerate them to the extent that they align with their own interests. And this idea of interest alignment is, of course, very, very important when we're talking about resistance, and particularly resistance in the labour process. So I'm just going to step across into labour process theory here and note two things. First of all, that there's, in classic labour process theory, there's an inherent conflict of interest in the labour process, of course, and the resistance strategies that workers can deploy sort of does exist on a kind of a continuum, really. So in labour process theory, as you probably know, this conflict of interest stems from employers wanting to drive down costs, workers wanting to have a living wage and decent terms and conditions, however that's defined. And I know there's tons of debate and tons of contributions around there. We reach compromise in the wage effort bargain, and it's equitable treatment. This is my point. It's equitable treatment that cements consent in the labour process over whatever time scale, and that is another rabbit hole you can go down in labour process theory. And what's interesting to note about platform work is that the control is all-encompassing, but it's narrow and it's intense. And so when workers are engaging with work on the platform, yes, it's narrow, intense work, it's short-term on a per-job basis, and there may be less of conflicts of interest. There may be less of a conflict of interest there for some, but not all workers, right? So there's during this like narrow, intense time when people are engaging with platform work, there's kind of these interests kind of come to the fore. And the ethnographies of platform work show us that these conflicts of interest arise again where there is a question of equity. So where there's a growing sense of unfair treatment at the hands of the algorithm and little in the way of remedy for the unfairness. So I think one of the best authors on this is Alex Rosenblatt. I really commend her work. And she does a lot of work with Uber and Uber drivers. And one of the examples she gives is upfront pricing. And upfront pricing in Uber, I don't use Uber because I live in the middle of nowhere and there aren't any Ubers, right? So I'm just going on what Alex Rosenblatt says here. But upfront pricing is where customers name their fare beforehand. And the drivers collectively discovered that they were being paid a standard rate for those rides, and Uber was pocketing the difference if the customer paid more upfront than the ride cost them. So they lobbied collectively for a tipping function in the app, and I think they got one. Alex Rosenblatt also talks about the driver's inability to challenge a customer rating if they feel it's been given unfairly and did not represent the experience of that particular ride, and they have no voice in this process. And this was particularly problematic for black drivers and drivers of colour who felt that white riders' prejudice had resulted in them getting a lower rating. And Kellogg, if we go back to Kellogg, theorises exactly how these feelings of unfairness can stem from algorithmic management. So we're back to the 6 R's here. So in the restriction and recommendation phase of platform work, Kellogg and colleagues talk about the experience of unfairness arising from a sense of frustration, awareness of bias, reduced well-being, reduced voice and precarity, and this is very much reflecting what I just said. In the recording and rating phase, this is the classic surveillance phase, the workplace surveillance phase, and we see exactly the same issues arise as we would see in a regular workplace. Issues of privacy, questions about how fairly work is represented in data, whether there's an ability for people to challenge results, and any kind of balance in a managerial process, so in-person assessments, the ability to be heard and have yourself fully represented is absent. And finally, if we're replaced by an algorithm, that's sure going to make you feel like you're in a precarious position, very frustrating, very stressful. And the rewarding phase, if it results in work intensification, is also a problem, right? Because it's stressful. And so these map very well onto the workplace surveillance literature as it stands. But for the type of resistance that might result, again, we look to traditional labour process theory, which says there's a continuum of resistance strategies that people may deploy that ranges from workers eking out space for agency by bending the rules, maybe using humour, cynicism, storytelling and public denunciation, those types of strategies, and then the establishment of shared collective interests, solidarity, collective action. And if you recognise that, you'll know that I'm referring to Ackroyd and Thompson's work on organisational misbehaviour from nearly 20 years ago. That was published now. But when we look at the way that resistance is accounted for in platform work, and Kellogg and colleagues call this a very natty little phrase, algo-activism, there we are. But when we look at this resistance to platform work, we see the same type of thing. We see, first of all, this idea of practical action, eking out agency by not cooperating with the rules, personally negotiating with clients, leveraging different interfaces. So Reid Musson and colleagues talk about, again, Uber. It has been very well studied. I mean, I suppose it's a really visible platform kind of work, is it? So it will be studied much better. Where Uber drivers set limits on what they're willing to accept, where they register on different ride-hail platforms and game them against each other, where they have 2 phones, one with a customer version of the app and one with the driver version of the app, to check the fairness of what's being offered to the customer and what they're being told to do. The next one is what we call platform action. So Turk-Opticon would be an example here of knowledge sharing on different fora, workers supporting each other, educating each other, sort of small acts of, small acts of resilience almost, and conducting reverse surveillance on the platform. And a really good study is Anwar and Graham, who studied platform workers in 5 Southern African countries, and looked at the pragmatic responses to surveillance and pragmatic responses to the platform, where workers were developing client relationships off platform, having done good work for them and working a way around that, really. The next phase it talked about is this idea of discursive framing of the algorithmic unfairness, so engaging in public critique, drawing others' attention to what's going on, calling for professional codes of ethics for people who write algorithms. And here we're starting to encroach on the Uber, again, the Uber conflict around proper recognition for labour rights. And finally, of course, then we do have the full legal and collective mobilisation. And not only are we going to talk about Uber here, but also the Deliveroo riders strike in 2016, both in Italy and in the UK, that's very well covered by Tassinari and Macaroni, and also Callum Camp's book, Riding for Deliveroo, which is a really excellent book. And I would also like to note there's an awful lot of Canadian scholarship here as well. It's been very well covered in recent years, in critical perspective, and particularly Marxist perspective. So that's where the literature is at present. And now I'm getting to the point of what this actually tells us about surveillance. And in many ways, hang on, I'm not quite sure what's on the next slide. There we go, yes. Phew, that is what I expected, sorry. What does this tell us about surveillance? Well, actually, you know, it tells us a lot of what we know already. I mean, a lot of the concepts that we have currently, both in labour process theory, in maybe organisation theory, and also on the psychological side of the study of work monitoring, can account for a lot of these phenomena. Surveillance processes are facilitating the employment contracts in both regular work and in platform work. Quite clearly, the difference is who is doing it, the ways in which it's balanced with other aspects of employment. And in platform work, obviously it's not. We have narrow, intense, pervasive, calculative surveillance, which is not visible, particularly as opaque. It cannot easily be challenged or negotiated. And that, I think, is quite bad, based on my knowledge of workplace surveillance. Similarly, we can see how accounts of resistance reflect the same patterns that we see in traditional employment. And there are new spaces for resistance, and there are new contested terrains in the employment relationship, particularly around the public-private boundary, the boundary around work and non-work as well. And that, I think, is something very applicable here. We can also recognise many phenomena and concepts from surveillance studies. So, you know, there are clearly panoptic logics going on here, you know, and there's plenty of people arguing that in various journals. People like Ivan Knocker, who talks about platform work being the ultimate panopticon. I'm not sure I agree with that, but we can see how platform architectures perpetuate certain forms of surveillance, and we can also see how there is little space in that encounter for resistance, but I'll come back to that again in a second. And we also see post-panoptic logic. So quite clearly, you know, the platforms are not existing to employ people, they're existing to exploit data and play the financial markets and divest themselves of any kind of costs in order to get the maximum financial return through the use of through their simulations and siphoning off the data they collect for other projects. You know, the Uber one is the classic Uber one, it's the driverless cars project that they're talking about. We also see other surveillance phenomena, multi-surveillance, like Winifred Poster's idea, the fact that, you know, there's lots of stakeholders involved. We see surveillance assemblage and the movement of data and the kind of purchase of and merging of companies behind this. We see digital enclosure as well, it's Mark Andreevich's idea. And also we see some ambiguous responses that we account for because whilst this is an observation that Graham Sewell makes about workplace surveillance, how we see ambiguous worker responses because surveillance facilitates work, it facilitates payment as much as controlling it. So we can sometimes be ambiguous in the face of workplace surveillance. But where this started to challenge my own thinking was in this area of the a priori assumptions that we make when we approach the question of workplace surveillance, because I was reading this and I was just going, hang on a minute, right? All of the studies and the meta-analyses of workplace surveillance start with the trope that employers want to see more and more, they want to control more and more, they want to get deep into the emotions, so sentiment analysis is a thing in regular employment, they want to get into sort of bodily movements, the voice and the analysis of the voice and all these kind of things. And the meta-analyses say that studies of surveillance now cover performance, location, movement, thought, feeling, emotion, reputation, identity, a whole gamut of phenomena around the individual as they work. And that's not what we have in platform work at all. Platform work surveillance is narrow, intense, calculatively rational, and reductionist. You don't want to see the whole person at all. And when we're looking at surveillance and platform work, I think our starting assumption has to be different. It has to be that platforms are organisations that do not want to see the people who contract their labour to them as workers. They don't want to be seen as employers in relation to these workers. They don't want to see an employment relationship at all. And not only do they not want to be seen as such by workers, they don't want to be seen as such by local authorities, by regulators, by trade unions, and by competitors. And part of the explanation for this is that platform style capitalism is almost nearly the end game of the financialization that's been going on in the corporate world in the last 40 years. So financialization, as I understand it, is a regime of accumulation. It's a new regime of accumulation where profits accrue through financial channels rather than trade and commodity production. And globalization and offshoring and outsourcing, where labour is more flexible and cost effective and so looks better on the books, is kind of one of the consequences of this. And this is what platform work is facilitating. But also in terms of organisational form, which is, as an organisation here, is the kind of thing I look at, the financialised corporation is asset lean. The platforms relying on outsourcing, gig work, global production strategies, and increasing involvement of the firm in financial markets and a focus on shareholder value, because that's what you want the financial wealth to feed off itself, is at the expense of quality work and of workers. And so is it any wonder then that we see sometimes these hyper-marketized individuals, freelance, self-employed platform workers working with a minimum protection, policed through heavily surveilled interfaces which hide behind a veil of secrecy? Well, no, but it's this veiling that started to make me think quite differently about workplace surveillance. So rather than being surveillant with 2 L's, I thought we might be having a situation where we have an organisational form which is surveillant, so with 1 L, with a superior ability to veil, to hide, to obscure, to make opaque the asymmetries that preserve power over outsourced platform labour. But all is not lost, because in my view, this is why the spaces away from where the work itself takes place become consequential. Because if we have a calculative rationality which is so reductive, it has blind spots, big blind spots. There are spatio-temporal gaps and fractures, as I called them in a paper I wrote in 2002 called Elements of Surveillance. And this will be where resistance can dwell. And very interestingly, Callum Cant, in his account of the Deliveroo strike in 2016, calls the trade unions, which was the independent workers of the world, the independent workers of Great Britain, 2 sort of affiliated unions, the invisible organisation, the coalition of the invisibles being fought by a coalition of invisibles in response. And this is very different from the way that we usually approach the question of surveillance in the workplace. And so this has led me to start to think differently about surveilled subjectivity as well. Now, again, this is one of my contributions. I'd like to talk about it a little bit. I wrote a paper in 2009 and followed up since on a phenomenon called exposure, which I coined really to try to get to the ways in which employees were exposed to employers. And I was interested in different subjective registers and how those are used to create value for the employer. So we have a performative register, maybe a kind of a register around anxiety or vulnerability. And there are others, there's, endocrinological, there's neuroscientific, there's also different subjective registers that are brought into the employment relationship. And my colleague, Maria Laura Di Domenico, I can't say her name, Maria Laura Di Domenico and myself, we used to work together at the OU where I worked before. She's now at Surrey. We explored this empirically through a study of, and don't think I'm mad, bed and breakfast owners. And the reason why we studied bed and breakfast owners is Maria had actually looked at this as part of some research that she'd done and discovered that they deployed really quite elaborate counter-surveillance behaviours in the face of covert inspections from the tourist board. Think about it, right? A bed and breakfast is based in a private home. So there's all sorts of boundary work going on. And the prospect of exposure to this covert surveillance actually drove resistance on the part of these B&B owners. The counter-surveillance strategies, which included things like stalking and outwitting the inspector, equipping oneself with the knowledge to preempt the inspector, criticising the criteria and testing them out by going incognito to other B&Bs. It was like sleuths. But that was their surveillance imaginary. And that's like the algorithmic imaginaries discussed earlier, trying to create a practical and tacit knowledge about what's going on. And so we observed how the B&B owners, when they were in control of the surveillance encounter, the exposure, that they were kind of prepared to do the boundary work they were prepared to do in the home. It was playful, it was empowering, it was thrilling. But when they were not, where there's potential for this inspector to come along, it was oppressive, anxiety-provoking, and fearful. And if we look at the algorithmic imaginary of platform workers, that tells us that platform workers themselves are working very hard to manage the way they are seen with the platform. They're working hard to manage their exposure, to pacify the algorithm, selectively exposing themselves to surveillance to avoid trouble. But we also see that there's identity work going on. It's gained, there are elements of performativity, hyper-meritocratic entrepreneurs and so on, to engage with this sort of algorithmic sort of surveillance they're subject to. But there's something else as well. And thinking about all the industrial action that's been spoken about in the ethnographies, thinking about the different ways in which platform workers have represented themselves to the platforms to try to change their terms and conditions. There's also something else going on with regards to underexposure. So the platforms that don't want to see the underexposed people. So there's a recognition trope here that we don't currently have in surveillance in the workplace. So for example, recognition of one's work equitably, the depth of the engagement with the work, recognition in the sense of being rated and rewarded for good performance, recognition in the sense of knowing what the algorithm does, how it works, and platforms recognizing themselves as employers. I think this is an important addition to the study of workplace surveillance. And it's that that's fueling the continuum of resistance from the individual surveillance and platform action through to some of the more, like the bigger disputes, like the Uber drivers went through to be recognized as employees. So I think that's where I'm going to stop. I'll just give a wee conclusion and then we can go into questions. So in conclusion, my report's out. You're welcome to read it. I think what I've done in this talk is consider platform work through a surveillance studies lens, although it can be accounted for and critiqued using the conceptual arsenal that we have already. I do think there's a visibility or invisibility dynamic, which is not what we would normally discuss in studies of workplace surveillance, that does need to be accounted for. And that ambivalence as well is something that's important. I also acknowledge that there's a lot that I've not said about the structural inequalities of platform work, and there's a lot to say there. That's not what I'm focused on, but that's important work as well. So education, migration, status, global north v south, inclusivity, participation, marginal justice. There's lots of work on that side of the platform economy, but I've not concentrated on that. But I am interested to hear how what I have said might have caused you to have new thoughts. I'll be interested in feedback. This is very much work in progress because I'm going to take this report on and develop some of the findings from it. So I think